The war that the United States and Israel launched against Iran is having a massive impact on the global economy. Every country on earth is being affected because this US-Israeli war has caused the largest oil shock in history, larger than the oil shocks of 1973 and 1979. The effects are especially pronounced in Asia, which gets the majority of its oil imports from the Persian Gulf. The Philippines has declared a national emergency, and it is now rationing energy because it does not have enough oil due to this war. Japan also imports much of its oil from the Middle East or West Asia, and this is why Tokyo has carried out the largest ever national release of oil from its reserves. Moreover, the 32 member countries of the International Energy Agency, the IEA, unanimously agreed to release 400 million barrels of oil from their emergency reserves. However, this is only a short-term band-aid measure. It's not a long-term solution, and this is why the global price of oil only went down a little bit in response to the news of countries releasing oil from their reserves. And since then, the global oil price has continued rising because as long as this US-Israeli war on Iran continues, there are going to be massive disruptions in the energy market. And given that oil is the most important commodity on earth, and it's used in many other products, and it's used in all aspects of society in order to transport food and other goods, world leaders are now warning this could cause a global recession. The head of the International Energy Agency said it very clearly. He warned that the US-Israeli war on Iran has been a major threat to the global economy. And this war is causing not just gasoline prices to go up, but also food prices to go up because so many fertilizers and chemicals used in fertilizers come from the Persian Gulf region. And it's also likely going to lead to higher interest rates, which will lead to increases in mortgage rates and other rates on loans that are taken by average people. So this is going to hurt the poorest people the most. So to make sense of how this war is going to impact the global economy, today we will be speaking with the renowned economist Michael Hudson, who's the author of many books, including Super Imperialism, the Economic Strategy of American Empire. And Michael Hudson has been writing articles and doing interviews explaining how this war is going to reshape the world economically and geopolitically. In particular, Michael has argued that this war has meant that multipolar oil markets are now a reality. And this is because Iran is directly challenging the global dominance of the US dollar, and in particular, the petrodollar system. The fact that for decades, the vast majority of oil in the global market was priced and sold in dollars. Iran is now challenging that. In response to this US-Israeli war of aggression, Tehran closed down the Strait of Hormuz, which is the single most important oil transit choke point on Earth. Every day, about 20% of the globally traded oil passes through this narrow strait, or at least 20% of global oil did pass through before the US and Israel started this war. And now Iran is telling countries that if they want to pass through the Strait of Hormuz, they have to agree to sell oil not in US dollars, but rather in China's currency, the yuan, which is why some media outlets are now saying that this Iran war could actually boost China's so-called petro-yuan and weaken US dollar dominance. So given the massive geopolitical and economic consequences of this war, I thought Michael Hudson would be the perfect guest. So without further ado, we're going to play some highlights of what Michael said, and then we'll go straight to the interview.
Iran has said, this is a phase change. We are now forever going to control the Strait of Hormuz and the Persian Gulf, and we are going to control the oil trade. And that means that instead of the United States plans to use oil as a choke point on other countries to enforce their compliance with American foreign policy, it's now Iran that is in control of this choke point. And it can impose sanctions on U.S. and its allies, sanctions on Israel, sanctions on the European or any other allies of the United States. So it's turned the tables on the whole U.S. attempt to use oil as a means of control. Now, what is at issue is Iran being able to achieve what the United States has based all of its foreign policy on: control of the international revenues from oil exports. The American philosophy is, number one, you bomb civilians. You break all the rules of international law, which are against that. You bomb civilians to demoralize them. And if you concentrate, as Trump did along with Israel a few weeks ago, you bomb the schools, you bomb the hospitals. That's American policy in foreign countries. It's most visible in the case of Israeli policy in Gaza and now the West Bank as well. And it's the same policy that the United States followed in Iran. Well, the idea was that this would demoralize the population, and the Iranian population would want to get rid of the Ayatollahs and say, we don't want to be bombed anymore. We want to save the children. We want let's make a deal and appoint a leader favorable to the United States so that it'll stop bombing it. Well, this is nonsense from the beginning, but it was the guiding spirit of American foreign policy. Bomb a country, and that will lead to a regime change and a collapse. This is a conflict in Iran to determine what will the shape of the international economy be. Is it going to restore American control of the oil trade and give it the choke point over the international economy that it's looking for, or are we going to be independent of the United States? That's what this war is all about.
Michael, it's always a real pleasure. Thanks for joining us today. Now, you've been talking about some of these issues that the world is now discussing due to the war in Iran, especially dollar dominance and the petrodollar system. You've been writing about this for decades, going back to the 1970s. And in fact, the US government has also been planning a potential war on Iran for decades. This is not something new. Now, Donald Trump is the first president who's actually crazy enough to try it. But I remember going back to the George W. Bush administration after the US invaded Iraq, there was a lot of discussion of a potential invasion of Iran. So, Michael, explain to us how you see this war. What is the bigger picture here, and how will this impact the world?
Well, you mentioned that it's for the last few years or decades, it's actually gone back half a century. I said already in the mid-1970s, when I was working for the Hudson Institute on contracts with the Treasury and the White House and the Defense Department, I sat in on meetings, and they were discussing all along how ultimately the United States was going to have to take control of all of the Middle Eastern oil, and that entailed conquering Iran. And in the mid-1970s, at one military meeting, for instance, Herman Kahn was explaining how probably Baluchistan was the main opportunity to begin carving up Iran into subject ethnic constituencies, and Baluchistan in between Pakistan and Iran was probably the best place to start a separatist movement. There were military plans. My field in the mid-1970s was oil and the balance of payments. I had that position at Chase Manhattan for many years, and I actually was the only. I was so low on the totem pole, being a technician in my mid-20s, that I was the only person who was allowed to see all of the operating details and statistics of the U.S. oil companies and the major companies so that I could make a calculation as to the role that oil played in the balance of payments, supporting the dollar. And this was right after the United States was forced off gold in 1971 because of the Vietnam War. So the United States all along has realized that this what you're seeing today was going to be the end game of consolidating, they hoped, American control over the Middle Eastern oil. And they wanted that because the center point, the strongest lever that American foreign policy has had for the last century, is control of the world's oil trade, because it's so immensely profitable for the American oil companies themselves. It's given the oil companies a major control over U.S. policy and also the U.S. economy, potential control over other countries, but by the ability to turn off the supply of oil to other countries and thereby stopping their electricity production, stopping their chemical production, their fertilizer production with natural gas. The oil industry includes the gas industry because they're so closely interconnected. All of this has been thought out, and every year, the military has been upgrading the long-term plans for, well, if we really have to use force to entail our control over over the Near East, Middle East, if for any reason the OPEC oil companies, countries, want to become independent of the United States and begin investing their oil profits outside of the United States instead of sending all of their oil earnings to the United States to invest in treasury bonds, corporate bonds, U.S. bank deposits, and stock holdings. Well, if any of them should want to exert their own sovereignty and go their own way, we're going to have to take over. And no matter what, we're going to have to take over Iran because that is the most powerful, final locking point of U.S. control. And as we've discussed before, in 2003, General Wesley Clark came right out and said, well, we're going to conquer 7 countries in 5 years, culminating with Iran. So all of this has been completely open. This is not simply Donald Trump's war. It's a war which he decided at this time because America has steadily been losing its position of economic strength, military strength by being and arms and supply of missiles and aircraft and bombs as a result of the war first in Ukraine and then supplying Israel. So there will never be a less bad time to go to war than at the present. And of course, it is a bad time, but it's not as bad as it's going to be. And the military and the neocons behind the military and behind the Central Intelligence Agency are not going to give up. They say, well, what do we have to lose? If we don't conquer the Middle Eastern oil now, then we're going to be losing our what has become the major lever of American foreign policy. And if we do conquer it, and Donald Trump believed that he could conquer Iran within 2 to 4 weeks, actually believed that. And his hope was by the time he went for his scheduled trip to China, he could confront China with saying, well, we've just caused a regime change in Iran. We're pointing out we've appointed an Iranian client oligarch, client dictator to take over and become sort of Iran's version of Boris Yeltsin, administering Iranian oil in the interests of the United States. So we now have the power to impose sanctions on you, China. We can cut off your oil, but we don't want to do that. If you begin to export the raw materials, the gallium, the tungsten, and all the other things that we need for our military that you've put a export control on, then we will give you the oil. He'd hoped to be able to present China with that victory. Well, obviously, that's gone. The military miscalculated because they all realize that this is a fight to the end to decide, is the United States going to be able to reassert its control over the world economy using monopolies, the oil monopoly, the information technology monopoly that it's trying to do, the computer chip monopoly, technology monopoly, also its food ability to supply food to other countries, its export control of grain. This is the last chance that it has, and the result is there's a feeling of desperation that's led the U.S. planners to bet it all, and I think that it's not going to work. All of the generals have told them that it's not going to work. The generals who've been pessimistic have pretty much been forced out of the military and the State Department because if you're pessimistic, well, why aren't you on board? Why aren't you on the team? America believed that it could not lose any war because its policy of bombing other countries was always going to work. The American philosophy is number one, you bomb civilians. You break all the rules of international law, which are against that. You bomb civilians to demoralize them. And if you concentrate, as Trump did along with Israel a few weeks ago, you bomb the schools, you bomb the hospitals. That's American policy in foreign countries. It's most visible in the case of Israeli policy in Gaza and now the West Bank as well. And it's the same policy that the United States followed in Iran. Well, the idea was that this would demoralize the population, and the Iranian population would want to get rid of the Ayatollahs and say, we don't want to be bombed anymore. We want to save the children. We want let's make a deal and appoint a leader favorable to the United States so that it'll stop bombing it. Well, this is nonsense from the beginning, but it was the guiding spirit of American foreign policy. Bomb a country, and that will lead to a regime change and a collapse. That was what America expected in Russia. But Iran essentially has the same spirit that Patrick Henry had in America's revolution against Britain in 1776. He said, give me liberty or give me death. And that's exactly what Iran is saying. And they're willing for them, this is existential because they know what the U.S. plans are, since the United States has been so open in what its plans are. Yes, they want a regime change. They want to break up Iran into parts. They want to take control of Iranian oil and use the oil export revenues to support the U.S. dollar and to support basically the U.S. economy and to give American foreign policy the option of turning off the oil to other countries, to saying, we can close down your industry, your chemical industry, all your industries that need electric power, oil, gas. We can do all that if you take an independent policy following your own sovereignty. And we in the United States reject the United Nations principle of every nation has its own sovereignty. This is the basic principle of Western civilization for the last half century, the basic principle of the United Nations Charter. All of that is being rejected by the United States. And what it's done is galvanize other countries to recognize that, well, yes, this really is the final conflict. This is a conflict in Iran to determine what will the shape of the international economy be. Is it going to restore American control of the oil trade and give it the choke point over the international economy that it's looking for, or are we going to be independent of the United States? That's what this war is all about.